Welcome to the first lesson in the Identity with Windows Server 2016 exam reference 70-742. And in this lesson, we'll be discussing the installation and configuration of domain controllers, or DCs. And this lesson is broken into 4 different topics. Our first topic is going to be the introduction of Active Directory or AD components and terminology. You need this as the foundation or the baseline for the remainder of the course. So don't blow by this thinking, I already know this. And I first want to begin with a flyby of the 5 different services that make up Active Directory. The first being the Active Directory domain services. We're going to spend a vast majority of our time in this course in this service right here. And what ADDS is a specialized type of database that's called directory, hence where we get Active Directory, that's going to store information about resources or objects, if you will, within the Active Directory space. In addition, we're going to talk about the Active Directory Federation Services, or ADFS. I'm going to warn you right now. I'm all about acronyms. I'm not going to continue to say Active Directory Domain Services or Active Directory Federation Services or Active Directory Certificate Services when I can say ADDS, ADFS, ADCS. So you'll see that as we come up through these different lessons in the course. Back to ADFS allows for the configuration and management of single sign-on. One thing your users don't like to do is enter the username or password over and over again. What we'll be able to do is use ADFS to configure what's called SSO, or single sign-on, to allow them to access resources both internally and externally, supplying one set of credentials. ADCS, which is a customizable service, and this is used for issuing as well as managing and revoking key certificates to secure your software systems. And ADRMS allows you to protect and control the distribution of information both internally and externally, which means you can define exactly what can happen to those documents. And the Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services, or ADLDS, is really just a simplified version of ADDS with most of the same functionality, but now we don't need an Active Directory domain or an Active Directory forest, and that's the key difference. Of these 5 services, most of our time is in Active Directory domain services, but we will have some conversations and topics on ADFS, ADCS, ADRMS, and I may mention ADLDS again as well. The Active Directory logical infrastructure contains several different layers or levels, if you will, and the top level is called the forest. The forest is a collection of ADDS domains, and they share a common schema. Schema is just a collection of objects and all of their attributes. All of your domain controllers, or DCs, have a copy of the schema, so you'll know what objects can be stored in Active Directory. And then the next tier are domains, and by default, when you create multiple domains within a forest, it automatically creates a two-way trust relationship. So now I can share resources from domain A with domain B, and domain B can share resources with domain A. So the trust relationship provides the sharing of resources. Your domains are really logical administrative units that contain all of your users as well as your groups and computers and any other object that's part of ADDS. And as you can see, within the domain, we can have a subdomain that's going to have a contiguous namespace. So we have domain A, then we have west in domain A and east in domain A, as well as we do in domain B. And in order for me to access domain A, I could use something like domaina.pearson.com. If I want to access a subdomain, it'd be west.domaina.pearson.com. In addition to domains, we have a tree, which is a collection of your ADDS domains that share a common root domain and have that contiguous namespace. So domain A is its own tree, and domain B is its own tree, as you can see here. And within each domain, we have organizational units, or OUs. We create these, and we use these for storing objects, and we also use these for applying group policies, or GPOs, and we'll see that later on in the course. Now, by default, when I install ADDS, there are a few built-in containers that are created for me. One's called computers, one's called built-in, and one's called managed service accounts. These containers are automatically created for you, part of ADDS, and because they're not OUs, I can't apply a GPO. And in addition to creating these containers during the install, one OU is created called domain controller, so we can use that for applying group policies to all of your DCs. In addition to OUs and containers, we have what are called sites, which is a logical representation of the physical location within your organization. So I can use a site to represent the United States, and I can use another site for representing Europe if I choose to do so. Within sites, we have subnets, which is another logical representation of a physical subnet on your network. By defining these subnets, it's now possible for me to determine the physical location and what services are offered in the forest. And these subnets work with sites, and when we install ADDS, a default site is created for us. That's simply called default-first-site-name. So every domain controller has a database, and each of these databases is broken into 3 partitions. Your ADDS information is stored in this database, which is located on all of your domain controllers. And some data changes more often than other data. So both the schema and configuration partition are considered forest level partitions, and the data rarely changes on those. But the domain level partition, this changes quite often, and every domain controller, unless you're using a read-only domain controller or an RODC, that RODC contains a read-only copy of that domain partition, but all the other domain controllers have a writable copy of that partition that contains all of the objects within your forest. As part of the planning for installing Active Directory services, there are a few things you need to determine in advance before you kick off that installation. The first is your Active Directory domain structure, and as you can see, we have 3 of them here. We have a single domain, which is pretty straightforward. It's a single domain and a single domain tree. Normally you're going to see this in a smaller organization with a centralized IT department. We have a multiple domain Active Directory infrastructure where we have multiple domains organized into a single domain tree. Normally, again, we'll have a centralized IT administration, but the clients may be more widespread or geographically dispersed. And then we have a multi-tree domain structure, which are multiple domains within multiple domain trees. You'll be using this in larger enterprise environments. And this is powerful because it allows you to delegate some of the administrative tasks to geographical locations while centralizing the administration of your ADDS critical components. Regardless of whether you use a single domain, multiple domain, or a multi-tree, all of them have the concept of a forest, a tree, and a forest root domain. Another thing we need to plan for before we roll out ADDS is what are called functional levels. We have 2 of them, the forest functional level, and then we have the domain functional level. All these do is determine what features are available. So the later the version of the functional level, the more features you're going to have. The forest functional level has Windows Server 2008 as well as 2008 R2, Server 2012, Server 2012 R2, and Server 2016. So if we have a forest functional level of Server 2016, our domain functional level has to be Server 2016. But we can choose to use a lower forest functional level if we have domains using one of those lower operating systems down to Windows Server 2008. So make sure your domain in the forest meets the minimum operating system levels. The earlier the functional level, the fewer new features you're going to see. And if you decide you want to up the functional level, all the domain controllers must meet the operating system requirements before you can up those functional levels. So it's important for you to determine what functional level you're going to use before you perform that installation. So these are the components and terminology I want you to be familiar with within ADDS. ADFS provides identity federation, which enables authentication across organizational as well as platform boundaries. It also provides for claims-based authentication where users access resources using some sort of token with claims about that user, what they are able to access. And then we also have the option for single sign-on. This authentication configuration is used so users are not required to provide credentials a second time for any third-party apps that they're accessing. Now, there's single sign-on and there's same sign-on. So you might see SSO a couple different ways. SSO in the ADFS world is single sign-on, no additional prompts for credentials. Same sign-on means you may see another prompt, but you'll use the same credentials. You'll have the same username and you'll have the same password because you're sharing your Active Directory information with that third-party software or something like within Office 365. So that's ADFS in a nutshell. We'll see more on that later on in the course. We have ADCS, or Active Directory Certificate Services. We have a couple options there. Enterprise. This is integrated with ADDS, so a lot of the processing and the certificates are automatically taken care of for you. And then we have a standalone. And if we're going to use a standalone, we're going to need an administrator to approve all of the certificate requests. We can create multi-purpose certificates with ADCS for VPN tunnels or SSL internet applications, which are used to identify individual computers and users. We create a key pair, a public and a private, on a server that contains the CA role, Certificate Authority. The public-private key binds the identity for that person or device. So make sure the two talking to each other are who they say they are. Once installed, the CA role creates, distributes, revokes, and we can even perform backups and restores of our certificates on that server hosting the CA role. Our last one is the Active Directory Rights Management Service, the ADRMS. We have two components here, both the client and the server, which encrypts the content within your common document formats, and that provides more of a fine-grained control for some of your sensitive documents. What this does is it allows you to protect the content within the document. You can specify who gets to decrypt it as well as when and where they can decrypt the content within that document. And this protection is embedded in the document, which allows me to prevent users from, we'll say, screenshotting that content or copying and pasting the content. So it's used to protect your proprietary information. So these are the 5 different services that we'll be talking about throughout the course, as well as the components that are part of ADDS. And we'll spend more time in these upcoming lessons drilling into these components and services.